In order for the economy to grow, many folks are saying that you need to see 3 to 5% energy growth year after year if we're going to win the upcoming AI arms race, against China. You absolutely have that there. Hello and welcome back to the America First Energy Podcast. I'm your host, Skyler Zunk, and in today's episode, I'll sit down with Mr. Pete Sepp, the president of the National Taxpayers Union. Pete and I chat about how local investments are helping to diversify tax revenue sources for counties, as well as Virginia's growing energy demand, and just how interconnected energy policy and tax and economic policy truly is. Later on, Ben will join me to discuss a recent study out of Virginia Tech on how property values are affected by nearby renewable energy projects. Here's my conversation with Mr. Pete Sepp. Well, welcome back to the America First Energy Podcast, joined today by a very special guest, Mr. Pete Sepp, the president of the National Taxpayers Union. Pete, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us for discussion on taxes and energy development and energy policy across the country. Would you tell us a little bit more about the National Taxpayers Union and the work you do surrounding energy policy?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do so, Skyler. And that's a great introduction because taxes, taxpayers, and energy policy are deeply interrelated. A National Taxpayers Union was founded back in 1969 to work for lower, simpler, fairer taxes, less wasteful government spending, and accountability from public officials at all levels. And so we not only work at the city or county level, we also work all the way up to the international level as part of a consortium of taxpayer groups around the world. And it's often been said, I guess, that, well, we need to be worried about healthcare policy because it comprises 1/6 of our economy. Well, energy comprises 6/6, in my opinion. And so it's vitally important that we link fiscal policy, not only taxes and spending, but also regulatory affairs, to the way energy works in this country, the way it's produced, the way it's transmitted, the way we look toward the future of our economy.
Well, Pete, I couldn't agree more. During my stint in the first Trump administration, my key takeaway was that energy policy is economic policy, and it's next to impossible to separate those two. Are there any particular taxpayers that are a focus of your organization and your work in this space? Is it individuals? Is it companies? Is it all of the above?
It is all of the above, like the energy strategy we need to have in this country. And there are very, very many taxpayers who are in the small business community who have joined NTU, and they're kind of caught in the middle of many policies, including energy policy. They, for example, depend upon larger companies to contract with. They depend upon individuals to be their customers if they happen to be public retail facing businesses. And so we want to pay attention to all taxpayers in this system because they're interrelated and interdependent.
Absolutely. Well, phenomenal. And tying things back to energy, as you well know, Virginia's energy demand is growing extraordinarily quickly. I think we're probably leading the country in our year-over-year energy demand growth, sitting at about 6%. And we have state policy that was set several years ago, expecting a 2% year-over-year growth in energy demand. Data centers, of course, are leading that very, very sharply in Virginia, AI investments, as well as industrial and residential growth. Do you have any advice for the Commonwealth? How do you think we dig out of our hole here, where we're currently importing 40% of our energy from other states on our PJM grid to fuel Virginia's energy independence and economic growth?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible when I started digging into the statistics that Virginia, by far, has the most data centers either in existence, planned or soon to become operational, even outstripping Texas and California. And that was a surprise to me, but it should be no surprise that given all of those data centers in existence, the energy demands are going to go way up. Now, I think the legislature made progress last year in Virginia by sending to the governor a bill, which he signed, that requires local utilities to be more aware of advanced transmission technologies. And those are things that help to enhance the transmission grid for electrical power at a very reasonable cost. And here, of course, is where ratepayers and taxpayers come into the equation. Advanced transmission technologies are things like balancing the loads when the weather conditions are right and you can move more power through your lines than when they're not right. That's a technology for advanced transmission, using new types of wiring material that help to move more power through the same lines without having to worry about all of the new siting and permitting processes for putting up lines in different and new places. That's an advanced transmission technology. Virginia's also done well in looking at co-location. In other words, having new facilities generate their own power, a natural gas plant or solar panels, for example. When you do that, you relieve ratepayers and again taxpayers of the burden of having to either finance the new capacity or subsidize it in some way. The power users, the big folks who need that kind of electricity, finance it on their own. If they're willing to do that, let them get the
Yeah.
permitting process out of the way so that they can develop at their own speed. You're not only saving tax dollars, you're probably saving time too, because the companies that need that power have an incentive to get it online quickly.
No, it's a phenomenal point, and that timeline is something that I'd like to dig in a little bit deeper into later in our conversation. But those grid enhancing technologies and those co-location of energy generation by those energy users is phenomenal. I love those ideas. That's a quick way to skip a lot of the queue delays to get interconnected to the grid, and does not require any new transmission to be built, but utilizing either that close proximity where it might be a 20-foot power line, or utilizing the capacity that we already have. Pete, you might be aware that about 90% of the energy that we've seen come online for the past several years have been from solar and storage sources, either sited together or separately, but being that near-term energy source that can be implemented relatively quickly, helping to meet this huge demand that we're facing. It's also helping to reduce some of the tax burden on localities. And we just saw an article that came out about a week ago showing that a county, a small county in Virginia, Charlotte County, has been able to reduce their tax burden and keep it lower because of some of the incomes that they're seeing from these energy investments. I believe they've got a gigawatt and a half of solar energy capacity coming online there. 15% of their county budget's been accounted for by some of these incomes. What do you think about those sort of local investments that are helping pay local taxes and keep that tax burden low for taxpayers?
Well, it's always a good idea for local governments, especially, to diversify their revenue sources. I mean, California is a big example at the state level that they rely very, very heavily on income tax receipts from their highest earners, chiefly income taxes paid on investment returns. When the stock markets or the bond markets even go bad in California, suddenly their revenues dry up because people just aren't making the same kind of money. Well, that's an important lesson also at the local level. You need to have diversified business pool that's contributing various corporate tax revenues and small business taxes, and not necessarily when one sector of the economy goes bad that you end up having a big revenue shortfall. Same with individual taxes. Solar revenues here are helping to keep the mix of revenue sufficiently diverse so that if property values go down, for example, and the locality experiences a drop in property tax revenue, you've got something to make that up. Now, in this case, I read that story you referred to. There was a reassessment going on, which could have resulted in a huge property tax increase for homeowners at a time when there's still a lot of economic uncertainty out there. And Virginia needs to work on its property tax burdens overall, according to the Tax Foundation's State Business and Personal Tax Climate Index. Virginia ranks about 28th in the nation, so roughly in the middle on overall tax burden, but is falling behind, doing pretty poorly on property tax. So if we're going to have the room to reform the system, to cushion homeowners from huge spikes in property taxes, we're going to have to look at the revenue side. And one way you do that is programs like these solar programs that can generate revenues, in addition to expenditure reductions.
Yeah, well, Pete, I certainly appreciate that. We see a lot of rural Virginia counties looking to diversify those property tax bases with some energy investments. But I'd say although those energy revenues directly are pretty attractive to folks like Charlotte that are paying 15% of their county budget with those revenues, what they're really hoping for is for that energy to attract more business development, for factories to come in that can utilize some of that new energy capacity, provide jobs, provide a lot more investment, and widen their tax base as well. And although solar and storage is what we're seeing in the vast majority of Virginia counties that are for the first time stepping forward and producing electrons for themselves, nuclear energy has been a big focus of Governor Youngkin's administration over the past 3.5 years, specifically advanced nuclear. How do you see advanced nuclear projects like SMRs contributing to the energy portfolio that Virginia has to offer moving forward?
Yeah, it's very important. And one problem that we've encountered over the years with nuclear energy development is that so much red tape, so much regulatory burden, so much of kind of the traditional way of government-directed investment has made the technology very expensive. So expensive, in fact, that ratepayers and taxpayers have often been forced to subsidize not only the construction of new plants, which has been pretty rare over the past several decades, but also their operation, and in some cases even their decommissioning, the so-called stranded costs. What we have with small modular reactors is the capacity to break from that past, to have micro development that's business driven rather than taxpayer driven, to the point where you're delivering good quantities of power where it's needed most with the transmission capacity already in place, and you're obviating the need for so many heavy subsidies on the part of ratepayers or taxpayers. You also have this going on in co-located behind the meter power sources. 3 Mile Island, for example, might be restarted, at least one of its reactors, in an agreement with Microsoft because they need the electricity for some of their data center and cloud purposes. SMRs are a great way forward, and you're also seeing new technological development for the first time outside of the national laboratories, the taxpayer-funded laboratories. Over in Texas, Abilene Christian University is building a very large capacity reactor using molten salt, and that's a new way that you do nuclear power without having so much water usage. Very promising. So Governor Youngkin is doing a good job kind of positioning the state at the forefront of that technological wave. And I'm pretty willing to wager that we're going to be saving a lot of tax dollars as well as generating a lot of energy at the same time.
That's really interesting. So you see the smaller scale nuclear as less of a risk to taxpayers because they're a little bit more compact, less likely to encounter cost overruns and need big taxpayer funded decommissioning plans as well. So the smaller investments, the more advanced technology just have a potential to be more useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about it, it's kind of a way of crowdfunding nuclear energy capacity because investors might be attracted to helping to fund one or two SMRs someplace as opposed to a giant complex of 3 or 4 mainline reactors that could take years to build and could have all different ways of going wrong. SMRs kind of avoid that. And so, definitely a win-win.
Interesting. So I think, although we've got several projects announced, with potential SMRs across Virginia, a lot is going to be up to the next governor and maybe the governor after that. Of course, Governor Youngkin has been a big supporter of this data center investment that's driving a lot of the energy demand growth in Virginia. We're in an election year. What do you think is going to be put on the shoulders of our next governor to maintain and hopefully build upon our energy independence and that load growth as well?
I think one key to this will be in Virginia remaining competitive with its neighbors in tax and regulatory policy. On the tax policy front, it's important to remember that report I cited earlier, with Virginia ranking 28th, roughly in the middle of the pack among states for good pro-growth tax policy. There's still a lot of room for improvement there, and it's especially vital because Virginia has a number of neighbors that rank very well on Tax Foundation's index. Tennessee is one. Both North and South Carolina are definitely making attractive tax policies, both for businesses and individuals. Low, flat rates that they're transitioning to, as well as offering good regulatory environments. South Carolina and North Carolina both are making progress on grid enhancing technologies, trying to figure out how to meet their own rising generation needs. South Carolina especially is in a tough situation, and they're going to try out a lot of novel regulatory reforms there, I'm pretty sure. And so Virginia's next governor has to remember that they're not only making policies for the Commonwealth, they're making policies to help the Commonwealth compete with other states.
Absolutely. Governor Youngkin, when he was campaigning, used to always say we have a choice to be like the sunny, free, or lower tax pro-business states to our south, or the less sunny, less free, higher tax states to our north. And I think our next governor will have to make that decision as well. Pete, you're based in D.C., and I know a lot of your focus is on this upcoming Big Beautiful Bill Act, the tax bill that's currently going through, I guess is in the Senate's hands now. There's been a lot of conversation about federal permitting reform. We don't see a lot of that on energy projects, and we don't see a lot of that here in Virginia just because there's very little federal land aside from the offshore resources that we have. But what are your big focuses there, and what do you think that permitting reform nationally could help deliver?
Well, I think some of the things to pay attention to in the One Big Beautiful Bill have to do with the repeal of many of the so-called green energy credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, there's a lot of debate going on among fiscal conservatives as to whether these credits should be retained, whether they should be enhanced, whether they should be done away with entirely. Well, the fact is, they are being phased out. The House and the Senate are currently discussing the phase-out timetable. The House's timetable for phasing out many of these credits would begin as early as 2026 for some of the consumer facing credits, the energy efficiency improvements in the home. Some of the others would be phased out by 2028. That's many of the credits involving wind and solar. The Senate may very well modify that again and say, well, we want to stretch the timetable out a little more to 2030 or some other year. But the point is, those credits cannot be counted on to deliver some of the all of the above energy strategy goals that we want to achieve. Some of it's going to have to happen with increased investment in technologies like SMRs. Other parts are going to depend, I think, on permitting reform. And there are only some in this so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. You have a one-year process, a limit, basically, on getting a permit for a pipeline project or a liquefied natural gas terminal project. But what you won't find in this bill moving through Congress now is the big bipartisan permitting reform effort that Joe Manchin, now retired senator from West Virginia, and Senator Barrasso pushed through or tried to in the last Congress. Came very close to passing but didn't make it, and that kind of comprehensive legislation is something that's going to happen outside of the One Big Beautiful Bill that's currently moving through Congress. It's important that it does. I think that needs to be enacted to send a message that even in the absence of those IRA credits, we can still do good things at the federal level to move energy policy forward.
I think that's a great point, Pete. I mean, we do need energy reform in the country, just writ large. We are only producing exactly what we need from day to day, and in order for the economy to grow, many folks are saying that you need to see 3 to 5% energy growth year after year if we're going to win the upcoming AI arms race, against China. You absolutely have that there. And I think what caught a lot of folks off guard is the big beautiful bill that came out of the House would phase out the investment tax credits for clean energy large-scale investments within 60 days. If they hadn't started construction, if they were waiting for some of the transformers for solar panels, for batteries to come in, those would immediately be phased out. So I hope that for these investors and these energy companies, clarity and budgetary reasons, that they're able to extend that out a bit to give a few year highway for those to be phased out relatively slowly instead of saying 60 days, it's all over. I mean, solar and energy storage are what are helping us meet our energy demand growths this year, next year, the next year. If we want to build a new natural gas generation facility, we're waiting 5 years for some of those turbines to be delivered. Nuclear might be an even longer lead time for those projects to come online. We should certainly keep some of the legacy investments online for as long as possible. But I worry that the big beautiful bill might be a little bit more beautiful if it phased out some of those credits slowly for taxpayer surety.
Yeah. I think a 2028 termination on the shot clock, I guess you would call it, for many of these tax credits could be feasible, but the 60-day provision where you have to break ground on a project, I imagine there are going to be more than a few Republican senators who would want to modify that provision in the bill. They're probably saying, look, there are House members with projects in their districts that this might be impacted, but almost every Republican state has at least one or two major projects that won't be able to break ground and could mean a loss of investment statewide. So they're taking a hard look at that, and my guess is there will be a lot of pressure to make sure that that 60-day deadline is made a little longer, preferably a lot longer. It's one thing to pull consumer-facing credits, such as the home energy efficiency improvement credits. It's here, but if you're not installing a new air conditioner, well, it's not available in 2026. You'll make some other choice. But investments in energy capacity are made on a much longer timeline.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm glad that the energy conversation is being brought into this big, beautiful bill discussion, because the administration's plan is to help grow the economy out of the deficits that we're seeing year after year, hopefully grow the economy out of the national debt. You have to have that energy there to fuel economic growth as more and more industries rely on energy from year to year. Pete, thank you so much for your time. I know we're short on time here, but we like to end all of our conversations with new guests with one quick question. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would that be and why?
Well, there'd be a lot of them, but I'd like to try George S. Patton to figure out what made that guy tick. He wrote a lot about his experiences in wartime, but it would be interesting to meet him in person and see if he would have any wisdom for the current age in which we find ourselves.
Interesting. I thought you were going to say the Boston Tea Party organizers fighting against unjust taxes, but George Patton would be a good one as well.
We don't know. We don't know who they are.
Too funny. Well, Pete, thank you very much for joining us today at the America First Energy podcast. We could not be more thrilled to welcome the National Taxpayers Union to this conversation. Thank you very much, and appreciate the work that you're doing in Washington and in state and local capitals all around the country.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you. Well, Ben, I really enjoyed that conversation with Pete Sepp, the president of the National Taxpayers Union. It was very kind of him to join us on the podcast and chat through the tax implications of energy policy and just how tied in energy policy is to economic policy. I mean, we hear this and see this every day. We got to chat with him about the local tax benefits to bringing new clean energy projects on the grid, keeping those taxes low for those county residents to make sure that real estate, personal property taxes are low and consistent when you have additional tax base and energy projects paying local taxes, and the demand increases that we're seeing across Virginia and what that means to stay competitive. Was super grateful because I think the conversation was rather timely as folks in Washington continue to debate the big, beautiful bill and its tax implications on the investment tax credits. I think the key takeaway here is that folks in any industry and households themselves just want to know what to expect. They don't want any surprises in their taxes. And the more clarity that our federal leaders can give us, whether that's keeping the investment tax credits, getting rid of them, phasing them out over a time horizon. They just want to know what that's going to be and have those uncertainties answered relatively quickly. I know it'll take place this summer. Regardless, clean energy is going to remain very competitive and it's going to be a growing part of our grid no matter what policymakers in Washington say.
That's right. The recent Lazard study came out and reaffirmed that without subsidies, renewable energy, utility scale is cost competitive and driving the market. And so it's great to bring in that conversation, like you said, in at such an important time, really talk about the broader implications beyond just our grid and energy generation on taxpayers that renewable energy can have on our local communities here in Virginia and across the United States.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. And in the news section, we want to drill into some of the more finite elements of siting clean energy projects like solar as they become even more prevalent and a growing part of our increasing energy supply here in Virginia and beyond. A lot of the questions that we hear at the local level have to deal with the particular land use and what the impacts on the neighbors are going to be. a big point of contention and sometimes misconceptions is around property values and what the impacts are to the property owner that owns the land on the solar facility, as well as the neighbors, and what that might be. We've seen a lot of different studies come out, but we just had one come out this past week from Virginia Tech doing a national assessment of land values surrounding clean energy projects. Do you want to walk us through this piece of news and some of its implications?
That's right. Yeah. So, of course, Virginia Tech, really close to me, just a couple of minutes down the road on Highway or Interstate 81, released a great new article detailing potential impacts of solar development, utility scale solar development on nearby property and land values. It's important to note, like you said, in the past, we've seen many different real estate organizations or different valuation companies evaluate what those impacts are. And generally, the findings are that when a project is well sited, well set back, and well shielded, the impacts on nearby properties are mitigated. But the findings here from Virginia Tech add an additional layer to that, which I think is important for us to highlight. So, like you said, the findings from this study suggest that residential property values within 3 miles of a project may see between 4.8 and 5.2% negative impact in a home value in immediately post installation. So that's post construction once the project's underway and has started producing energy. Now, they note, though, that over the next decade following that installation, that impact continues to decrease till about the 9-year mark, which is when that impact is effectively nullified. It becomes statistically insignificant, can't be seen. Now, moving over, the study also doesn't just look at property values, but it also looks at land values. So it notes that vacant and agricultural land within 2 miles may see a significant increase in value up to around 19.4% or close to 20%. But as with the property values, they note that this increase occurs right around the 3-year mark and then effectively disappears at around or becomes nullified around that 6-year post installation or post operation date. The last thing that I'll note in terms of the findings statistically is that homes on properties are with greater than 5 acres of land have a neutral net impact. So these different forces working on property values and land values work against each other and effectively nullify any impact on a property greater than 5 acres. Now, the important additional layer that I mentioned that this study adds to those additional studies that have been in the solar ecosystem for a while now is that the researchers at Virginia Tech argue that in communities where these impacts are most noted, it has little to do with visual or physical impacts of the projects, but rather a negative stigma associated with renewable energy. So, just to break that down a little bit, in a community where there may be some pre existing notions about what renewable energy or solar may be or may do, it effectively becomes a self fulfilling prophecy. And in those communities where there's that additional preconceived stigma, it leads to greater impacts on property values. And so, as we get into this a little bit more, I know, probably want to set the stage with a story from you, Skyler, having grown up or having property, your parents near a solar facility, can give us a little bit more context to this conversation. So tell us that story.
Yeah, this is all super interesting, Ben, and trying to parse through some of this and make sense of it. But I think it ties down to good policy and individual site considerations. As you mentioned, I grew up on about 25 acres, and within the past few years, a solar project was developed and permitted on the immediately adjoining parcel of property. So I grew up in a rural part of Chesterfield County, right next door to my grandparents and other members of my family. And we had to go through the same conversation ourselves and get to weigh in on what we wanted to see on the neighboring 2,000 acres of timber plantations. And we did have some of these concerns, but we're absolutely okay with the setbacks that the developer was pledging to put on this project, from roads, from homes, from view sheds, and ultimately became very, very comfortable with it. I mean, so did the rest of my neighbors up and down the road I grew up on. We're in an area that's seeing a lot of other sorts of development, like residential, mixed use, strip malls, you name it, a lot of development, and we essentially decided that we would rather see a solar farm be our immediate adjoining neighbor rather than another 2,000 home subdivision, which is tends to be the most frequent land development in our neck of the woods. And it ultimately comes down to, do people understand what it is? Are you going to be able to see it? How respectful is the development being of neighbors? Are you adequately set back? Are there vegetative buffers in place that you can preserve, or in places where you need them, plant additional bufferings? And I from our perspective, we're not at all concerned. I mean, we'd rather stay in a quiet corner of the county next to a quiet solar energy facility, rather than a noisy new road neighborhood that requires new infrastructure upgrades, more schools, et cetera, et cetera. So it comes down to those type
Right.
specific concerns. But when folks understand these things, I think the article and the study bears out that when the stigma is removed, there's not any measurable impact.
Right, and you make it pretty clear in that retelling of how kind of that project came to be, that what it takes is an engaged process, working with neighbors, working with community members to chip away at that stigma. Of course, Energy Rights working to provide those resources, those educational opportunities. But when a project is coming forward, it's important not only that we engage, of course, the project engage the community, but community members should be engaged, asking questions. The best way that we can address this property values concern is by having these conversations and making sure these projects, like you said, are well set back, they're well shielded, and that they are following, proper techniques that we know and have seen be successful in Virginia. Like, you know, the report says essentially it's not visibility that's the main culprit, right? It's not being able necessarily to see the projects that's making these huge shifts like we may hear in the field pretty often. Rather, it is that stigma associated with the renewable energy that's having a significant effect in particular communities. And this study actually, it looked at over 8 million, almost 9 million real estate transactions around about 4,000 solar facilities. And so this is a nationwide conversation, and a nationwide, effectively call to engage more of our neighbors and communities when we're having these conversations, to make sure that we can address any potential impacts from the project.
Yeah, Ben, I think it underscores that perception is reality in property values and in most things in life. I mean, it's really up to those individual community members and what they think about clean energy, whether they want to assign a stigma to it or want to assign something positive to it. The study also mentioned that different counties think differently, and that difference of perception directly translates to the difference in some of these positive or negative impacts. Super interesting. Excited to chat more with the study authors in the future about this and some of its implications in Virginia and beyond.
That's right. Yeah, we're really looking forward to continuing this conversation. It's exciting to know that Virginia Tech is really working on this. Of course, a university here in our home state of Virginia that's leading the way in innovative research, trying to figure out how can we better support new energy generation in Virginia that supports our communities, supports our landowners, supports our agricultural community, while also ensuring that the neighbors are involved and that these projects are really providing that elevation to everyone in the community, which we know they can. I mean, we hear stories all the time about the benefits of these projects. Most recently, of course, Charlotte County was able to really balance their budget and provide that relief to their taxpayers in the county because they had this investment from these projects. And we recognize that when done right, when they are responsible, these projects, when they follow good local policy, we're able to really elevate our communities. And this study just helps guide us a little bit further down the path toward a more productive solar and renewable energy environment for Virginians.
Thank you for joining us for the America First Energy podcast, brought to you by Energy Right. You can find our show on Spotify, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcasts, and you can find full videos to accompany our episodes on the Energy Right YouTube page. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Skyler Zunk, and Ben Wilson, produced by Kayla Ventura with audio and visual support from Dylan Taylor. A big thank you to our guest, President of the National Taxpayers Union, Mr. Pete Sepp. Join us next time for the America First Energy Podcast.